the wound that speaks. Power, violence, and the collective shadow. I speak to you not as a politician, nor as an arbiter of worldly disputes, but as a psychologist of the depths, a witness to the strange commerce between psyche and society. When a public figure falls to violence, the nation does not merely lose a life. A fissure opens in the body of the collective, and something long repressed rushes out like air from a punctured lung. In the death of Charlie Kirk at Utah Valley University on the 10th of September, 2025, you are not only confronting a crime scene, you are confronting a mirror. The image is terrible precisely because it is accurate. The psyche does not lie when blood darkens the floor. It tells you, in its own brutal grammar, what has been hidden from consciousness, that your collective life is under the spell of forces you would rather not examine: power, violence, and the shadow that the crowd casts when it becomes a single roaring beast. Let us name a few sober facts before we descend. On that September evening in Orem, Utah, during a campus event, a shot cracked the air and a young man collapsed. Reports quickly converged. A fatal shooting during a public appearance, a suspect or person of interest described in tactical garb in early dispatches, national and international leaders decrying the act as a political assassination and a symptom of escalating political violence in the United States. Investigations are ongoing. Details about the shooter's identity, motive, and affiliations remain fluid, disputed, or incomplete, as is often the case when fresh blood has not yet dried on the ground. What is not in dispute, because it cannot be, is that a public killing occurred and that it has been received as both a private tragedy and a symbolic wound in the nation's political skin. I will not speculate about the assailant's personal psychology. The ethical analyst resists the pornography of conjecture. Instead, I will speak of the collective, that mind which takes shape when millions of private fantasies and fears condense into a storm front that rolls over a people and turns individuals into carriers of an ancient contagion. When the crowd acts, no one is merely oneself. The many become a one, and that one has a shadow as surely as any single soul. The shadow, in my terms, is the denied, unintegrated portion of the psyche. The impulses, fears, and hostilities rejected by the conscious personality. What you disown in yourself does not vanish. It becomes autonomous, often projecting itself outward. The more you insist upon your innocence, the more violently you will seek a culprit to carry your darkness for you. Individuals do this to other individuals. Nations do this to factions, classes, races, parties. When history is tense and identity is brittle, politics becomes the theater in which the shadow auditions, scapegoats, observe the choreography that follows such an assassination. Within hours, rival mythologies begin to bloom. One narrative insists that the victim was targeted because of his ideology, that the deed confirms a pattern of escalating violence against conservatives. Another counters with cautions about premature conclusions or points to opposing incidents to argue symmetry. The facts are still being gathered, yet meaning rushes in to occupy the vacuum, because a collective cannot abide the abyss of senselessness The wound demands a story. Political leaders from across the spectrum condemn violence, yet their condemnations are absorbed back into the tribal nervous system, interpreted through the same filters that preceded the event. Even statements meant to unify are recruited by the shadow to sharpen divisions. This is not mere hypocrisy. It is psychic economy. A system overloaded with anxiety seeks discharge. In an age of permanent mobilization, where the news cycle is an intravenous drip and social platforms function as collective dream machines, the psyche seldom rests. Each day delivers a torrent of images that inflame archaic circuitry. Fight, flight, annihilate, avenge, you name it, information. But much of it is excitation, symbolic electricity, surging through a population whose emotional regulation has been outsourced to algorithms that reward outrage with visibility and cynicism with virality. In such a climate, a single shot does not only strike the flesh of a man, it detonates the symbolic explosives he has been made to carry for his admirers and adversaries alike. The person becomes an archetypal vessel, the hero to some, the adversary to others, and death seals a transformation. The man is gone, the image begins its afterlife. To interpret such an event, we must speak of power, not merely institutional power offices, laws, and police, but psychic power, which is subtler and often more decisive. Political actors accumulate this kind of power by speaking to the orphaned energies in a people: resentment, fear, longing, pride. Leaders who channel these energies to mobilize supporters are not monsters by that fact alone. Charisma has always been an economy of the sacred and the dangerous. Yet, the greater the concentration of projection upon a figure, the more citizens deposit their unlived lives. Their hates, they cannot own, and their loves, they cannot confess. The more that figure is pressed into a symbolic role that invites violent redress. For those who cannot tolerate their own shadows, the most efficient fantasy is to remove the living screen upon which they have projected it. Assassination is the ultimate magical act of the disintegrated psyche. Eliminate the vessel, and you imagine you have annihilated the unbearable content, but this is a lie. The content simply migrates, the shadow is hydra-headed, kill one embodiment, and the archetype finds another host. This is why political violence fails as therapy. It cures nothing, it intensifies the possession. Now, I do not argue that every political murder is reducible to collective dynamics. There are personal pathologies, delusions, tragedies of singular biography. Yet even the most idiosyncratic assailant operates inside a larger mythic weather system. Over the last decade, your republic has experienced a notable spike in both the rhetoric and incidents of political hostility, assaults, plots, attempts, and now, again, a successful killing. The dead do not consent to be enlisted in sociological arguments. Nevertheless, a pattern presses upon consciousness. Scholars, journalists, and institutions have chronicled the trend. High-profile violent episodes have entered the common storehouse of national anxiety. Whether one emphasizes asymmetry or reciprocity in these patterns, the felt reality to the collective is that the boundary between speech and force has thinned. The country dreams of enemies at breakfast. It scrolls through apocalyptic omens at lunch. It falls asleep to the glow of an eternal emergency. In such an atmosphere, the unconscious does what it always does under stress. It regresses to mythic binaries, purity versus pollution, innocence versus evil, tribe versus barbarians. This is the moral physics of a nervous system that has forgotten how to suffer its own contradictions. The labor of adulthood is to carry ambivalence without splitting the world into angels and demons. The labor of a mature polity is the same. Where ambivalence is denied, scapegoats will be found. Political language then becomes an incantation, not to illuminate reality, but to enchant the tribe and curse the enemy. The crowd is not satisfied with a policy victory. It wants exorcism. I hear, even now, the mind's protest. But our side did not start this. Or this is the inevitable response to their excess. In analysis, this is the moment when the patient responds to an interpretation by recruiting the very defense that created the symptom. The cure is not to locate the original sinner. The cure is to withdraw projection, to recognize how one's own fear and aggression have been unconsciously outsourced to adversaries. Without this, today's victim becomes tomorrow's justification. The spiral descends. Consider how swiftly the interpretive machinery engages after a killing. Some declare a pattern of targeted violence against one ideological community. Others contest the frame. Still others internationalize the event, reading it as a message to a president, a movement, a future. Each narrative has fragments of truth. Each also risks instrumentalizing the dead for the living's symbolic needs. The ethical demand upon a wounded polity is to suspend its appetite for instant meaning long enough to let reality speak, to listen to investigators, to honor the tragic specificity of this life and this loss, and to mourn without converting grief into ammunition. You cannot integrate a shadow. You refuse to grieve. Yet I also know human beings. Grief rarely stands alone. It travels with anger. The question is not whether anger will appear, but whether it will be conscious. Unconscious anger demands sacrifice of speech, of law, of a human other. Conscious anger demands limits lawful process, standards of evidence, protection for the innocent, and firm boundaries against calls for retaliatory violence. When a governor declares the gravity of the act and references the most severe penalties within the law, the psyche hears both a promise of order and a whisper of blood logic. The collective must take care that justice, in its ferocity, does not become the mirror image of the same archaic urge. It condemns. The state must not become the crowd. Now let us turn briefly to the archetype that has seized so much of your political life, the warrior. In its healthy expression, the warrior defends borders, protects the weak, sacrifices for the common good. In its pathological deformation, the warrior becomes the avenger, a figure intoxicated with purity, aroused by the fantasy of final solutions. Modern media ecologies, with their constant provocations, invite the overactivation of the warrior without the tempering presence of the sage, discernment, the lover, relatedness, or the healer, integration. A nation of permanent warriors is a nation of permanent wounds. This is why, paradoxically, the most political act an individual can perform after such a killing is psychological, to confront one's own shadow with rigor. Ask yourself, What stories do I tell that absolve me and demonize them? Where have I outsourced my unlived life, my unrealized strength, my unowned rage onto a leader or a nemesis? Which facts do I selectively admit because they serve my righteousness? What makes me feel secretly alive when a headline confirms my tribe's myth? The assassin, whoever he proves to be, whatever motives he owned, cannot carry the entire darkness of a nation. Nor can the slain bear the whole radiance of its hopes. The inflation of either figure is a sign that the collective has fallen under the spell of archetypal possession. When possessed, you do not have emotions. Emotions have you. You do not use ideology. Ideology uses you. The proof of possession is simple. You cannot imagine the humanity of the other side without feeling that something in you is dying. In truth, it is. What dies is the fantasy that you are good because the other is evil. What is born, if you permit it, is moral adulthood, which begins in the recognition that the line between light and shadow cuts through every human heart, every party, every movement. This recognition does not paralyze action, it sobers it. You still pursue justice, protect speech, argue policy, secure events, and demand accountability from those who inflame tensions for profit. But you do so without feeding the sacrificial engine that demands another victim to confirm your innocence. There is a final cruelty in a public assassination. Beyond the obvious sorrow, it simplifies a human being into a symbol forever. For admirers, the dead are frozen as a martyr. For detractors, as a totem of all they hate. If you would escape the undertow of the collective shadow, resist the simplification. Remember the person as a person complex, contradictory, developing precisely the status. The crowd denies when it anoints heroes and conjures monsters. And when leaders, influencers, or media figures become lightning rods for projected passions, demand of them and of yourselves the discipline to de-escalate rhetoric that binds identity to annihilation fantasies. In an atmosphere where assassination is imagined as destiny, every militant figure becomes a potential right. Withdraw the invitation. I began with a mirror. Let me end this first movement with an unsettling claim, one you may not wish to hear. The assassin is the nation's symptom. He is not its explanation, nor its excuse, but its symptom, a walking condensation of fantasies the collective refuses to own. If you answer the symptom with nothing but counter-fantasy, if you interpret this killing only as a confirmation of your side's myth, you will incubate the next symptom. The spiral will tighten, the images will darken. The gods, those old powers we pretend not to believe in, will feast on fresh offerings. A different path is possible. It is not dramatic. It does not look heroic on television. It begins in the small, humiliating labor of self-interrogation, proceeds through the civic tasks of law, fairness, and security, and culminates in the cultural work of deprojecting enemies so that conflicts can be metabolized without sacrificial rites. A republic that can do this will still know passion. It will still lose people to madness and malice. No social order can banish tragedy. But it will not need tragedy to remember who it is. If you would honor the dead, refuse to let the shadow write the sequel. References for factual context. Initial reporting of the shooting and death during the Utah Valley University event. Early descriptions of a person of interest and ongoing investigation, bipartisan condemnations, and framing as political assassination, obituaries and live updates, documenting timing and impact, research and commentary on rising political violence trends in the U.S., power as possession, archetypes, charisma, and the machinery of projection. Power is not merely an arrangement of institutions or the capacity to coerce bodies. Power is also a psychic current. When it gathers around a person, it does not only elevate them to visibility, it transforms them into a symbolic figure, a carrier of archetypes that far exceed their biography. A leader may be intelligent, cunning, compassionate, or crude, but these traits alone do not explain their charisma. Charisma arises when a population pours its unconscious energies into a vessel. The vessel becomes radiant, inflated with borrowed light. It is not the man who shines. It is the projections that gleam upon him. Charlie Kirk, in his ascent as a conservative activist, became such a vessel. Whether one loved him or despised him, one rarely saw him as a man among men. He was seen instead as a signifier, a marker of generational revolt, ideological polarization, and useful militancy against what his movement called cultural decline. The details of his policy positions mattered, yes, but what mattered more was the psychic electricity he carried for those who felt unheard in the reigning order. He spoke with the tone of one who believed himself at war, and in a polarized society, that warlike tone resonated. To his admirers, he incarnated the archetype of the young warrior, standing against corrupted elders and hostile elites. To his adversaries, he was cast as a dangerous demagogue, a disturber of civic peace, the face of a regressive tide. In both cases, notice the pattern. The man is swallowed by the image. This is what I mean by possession. Archetypes are not abstractions, they are living energies. When activated by collective anxiety, they behave like gods, demanding sacrifice, feeding on attention, bending reality to fit their myths. In earlier ages, you worshipped them in temples. Now you worship them in media cycles. The god of war, the god of purity, the god of the avenger. These deities did not disappear with the old pantheons. They migrated into the unconscious, waiting for historical moments to break the surface. Possession by the archetype of power is especially dangerous. Unlike the lover, who can be tempered by tenderness, or the sage, who can be moderated by wisdom, the archetype of power is inherently expansive. It wants more. It wants to dominate, to radiate, to prove itself against obstacles. When a leader becomes the carrier of this archetype, he or she is rarely in full command of it. The archetype commands them. This is why men and women who attain sudden charisma often display symptoms of inflation, certainty without nuance, moralization without humility, declarations that brook no contradiction. They are no longer themselves. They are the mouthpiece of a god. Now consider the crowd. The collective is not merely a sum of individuals. It is itself an organism with drives. When the crowd invests its fears and hopes into a figure, it unconsciously demands that the figure remain purely heroic, if admired, purely demonic, if despised. real human contradiction threatens the projection. The crowd does not want a leader who sometimes doubts, sometimes errs, sometimes changes. It wants an icon. Icons, however, are brittle. They crack under pressure, and when they crack, the collective responds with rage or despair. This explains why charismatic leaders so often become lightning rods for violence. They have been inflated by projection to a degree that makes them unbearable to the unconscious. One group cannot tolerate their visibility, the other cannot tolerate any attack upon them. Thus, the very energy that makes a figure powerful also renders them vulnerable. The psyche does not give power without demanding payment, and the payment in history has too often been blood. Here we come to the machinery of projection. Projection is the psychic mechanism by which one disowns aspects of oneself and perceives them instead in others. In ordinary life, you project your hidden aggression onto a neighbor, your disowned ambition onto a rival, your denied sensuality onto a stranger. In collective life, the scale is magnified. A movement projects its feelings of weakness onto an enemy group. A nation projects its fear of decline onto a scapegoat. An ideology projects its contradictions onto a political figure. Projection is not voluntary. It happens automatically when consciousness cannot bear to admit its own content. The American body politic in recent years has been saturated with projection. Conservatives project cultural tyranny onto progressives. Progressives project authoritarian hunger onto conservatives. Each side is correct and each side is wrong. They are correct that the adversary bears dangerous impulses. They are wrong in believing the danger resides only there. The archetypes of tyranny and violence are alive in both camps, though in different guises. Denying this fact fuels the spiral. Each side grows more certain of its innocence, more convinced of the other's guilt. It is in this climate that a man like Charlie Kirk became more than himself. He became a screen upon which the anxieties of an era were projected. For one half of the nation, he symbolized resistance against cultural dissolution. For the other half, he symbolized the resurgence of illiberalism and aggression. He could not simply exist. He had to signify, and in the logic of the unconscious, what signifies too much becomes unbearable. Someone, somewhere, will eventually attempt to break the spell by breaking the vessel. I call this dynamic the sacrificial logic of the collective shadow. The crowd does not consciously say, "We will offer blood to cleanse our anxiety," but the unconscious drives the play nonetheless. A figure is invested with too much psychic energy. The weight of the projections becomes intolerable. An act of violence erupts that releases momentarily the unbearable tension. The crowd experiences this release as shock, grief, fury. But beneath these conscious emotions lies the darker satisfaction of the unconscious. The sacrifice has been made. The god has been fed. The unbearable charge has been discharged, at least for a time. Yet such satisfaction is temporary. The projections do not disappear. They migrate. Another figure is chosen, another vessel inflated. The machinery grinds on. The question before America now is not simply who killed Charlie Kirk or why, but whether the nation is willing to confront its complicity in the machinery itself. If you respond only with more projection, insisting that this proves the unique evil of the other side, you guarantee the machinery's next cycle. If you respond with the courage to interrogate your own shadow, to recognize how your tribe's rhetoric and fantasies have helped inflate figures into unbearable vessels, you may begin to dismantle the sacrificial engine. But let us be honest, history does not offer many examples of such maturity. Nations rarely withdraw projections voluntarily. More often, they continue until the machinery consumes so many lives that exhaustion itself forces a reckoning. My appeal to you, then, is not naive optimism, but tragic hope, that this latest eruption might serve as a mirror too terrible to ignore, and that some portion of the citizenry might awaken from the possession before the next sacrifice is demanded. Media alchemy, how platforms transmute anxiety into violence. If one wishes to understand why an assassination resonates with such intensity in your time, one must not only analyze the psyche of the nation, but also the machinery that mediates that psyche to itself. In former ages, a killing would ripple outward through rumor, printed sheet, or the pulpit's voice, each step slowing the spread, each retelling allowing for some degree of reflection. Today, the interval between the shot and the collective imagination is nearly non-existent. Within seconds, a video circulates, a headline explodes, hashtag trends. The medium does not merely report the event, it transmutes it into a symbolic storm. I call this process media alchemy. Like the medieval alchemists who sought to transmute base metals into gold, modern platforms transmute the base material of human anxiety into the glittering coin of virality. But unlike alchemists whose ambitions were metaphysical, the platform's ambitions are commercial, outrage, fear, and tribal affirmation. Keep eyes fixed to the screen. Fixation produces data, data produces profit. The consequence is that your nervous systems are recruited into a perpetual economy of excitation. In this economy, an assassination is not simply a crime, it is content. It becomes a video clip cut into fragments, 1,000 captions and interpretations, a flood of reactions that rapidly harden into memes. These memes then cycle back into the political bloodstream, fueling further projection. Each tribe shares the clip with commentary. See, this is what we warned you about. Or, this is the violence their rhetoric breeds. The event becomes a Rorschach blot, interpreted in ways that reinforce prior convictions rather than disturbing them. From a Jungian perspective, what matters most is not the information, but the archetypal charge that images carry. A shaky video of a public figure collapsing to the floor is not processed neutrally. It strikes ancient nerves. The psyche remembers the sacrificial victim, the slain king, the martyred prophet. It remembers Caesar at the Senate, Lincoln at Ford's Theater, Kennedy in Dallas. These images form a mythic lineage, and the new death is instantly absorbed into it. Whether or not the slain deserves the comparison is irrelevant. The collective unconscious makes the association without asking permission. Thus, the platforms act as accelerants. They take the raw trauma of violence and accelerate its absorption into the mythic imagination. A moment of horror becomes, within hours, an archetypal drama. Hero versus tyrant, martyr versus monster. The more an event is repeated on screens, the more archetypal it becomes. The man vanishes, the symbol grows. This has two profound consequences. First, it makes it nearly impossible to grieve. Genuine grief requires slowness, specificity, silence. One must face the raw fact of a life extinguished and allow the pain to seep into consciousness. But the media machine interrupts this process. It demands commentary, reaction, mobilization. Grief is short-circuited by polemic. Instead of "I weep for the dead," the collective says, "This proves what I always said. The wound cannot heal because it is never permitted to ache. It is conscripted into propaganda almost immediately." Second, the machine normalizes violent imagination. Even those who condemn the act cannot help replaying the image. In seeing it, they become participants in its psychic economy. The repetition of the act imprints itself upon the collective nervous system, subtly lowering thresholds. The more the image circulates, the more the unconscious absorbs the fantasy. This is possible. This is what happens to figures of power. Such fantasies linger. They shape daydreams, inspire blood, recruit unstable minds. Violence begets violence, not only through politics, but through imagination. I do not claim that media causes assassinations in a direct, mechanical sense. The human psyche is too complex for such crude causality, but I insist that media conditions the field in which such acts become thinkable. When every event is instantly alchemized into a tribal weapon, the unconscious concludes that the most effective way to make meaning is through spectacle. And what spectacle surpasses the spilling of blood in public view? Consider also the asymmetry of attention. 1,000 acts of goodness, charity, and moderation pass unnoticed. A single act of violence saturates the collective field. This imbalance teaches the psyche to equate power with destruction. It whispers, "If you want to matter, to be seen, to break the trance of anonymity, violence is the fastest path in a culture addicted to visibility." This whisper is poison. The remedy, in principle, is clear. Consciousness of media dynamics, individuals and institutions must learn to treat the flood of imagery not as transparent reality, but as a psychic potion designed to intoxicate. The first discipline is abstinence from instant interpretation. The second is refusal to project myth upon raw events before facts emerge. The third is cultivating spaces where grief can exist without immediately being transmuted into fuel for war. But such disciplines are rare. They demand a spiritual maturity that runs against the design of platforms and the appetites of the collective. You may protest that the platforms are neutral, that they merely host human expression. This is a half-truth. They are neutral in the sense that electricity is neutral, but like electricity, they obey certain logics. The logic of virality is not neutral. It privileges speed, extremity, and repetition. If you pour human anxiety into such a vessel, you will not get calm dialogue. You will get amplification of archetypal conflict. The shadow thrives in such soil, and so when Charlie Kirk was shot, the event did not remain a tragedy. It was rapidly metabolized into tribal mythology Those who loved him invoked martyrdom. Those who opposed him spoke in tones of destiny, fulfilled or dark inevitability. Few paused to remember the man in his ordinary contradictions, friend and foe, thinker and agitator, citizen and son. The media machine rarely permits ordinariness. It demands echo because icons circulate better than men. This, then, is the alchemy. Anxiety in a spectacle out, projection in polarization out. A single event becomes a mythic drama, and the nation plays its assigned roles. The unconscious gods are delighted. They have received another sacrifice, but let me warn you, the gods are insatiable. They will not be satisfied with one offering unless the collective learns to interrupt the cycle of projection and spectacle. More victims will be demanded, and each time the machinery of media will ensure that the shadow grows more voracious, the crowd more divided, the archetypal energies more inflamed. The choice before you is stark. Either learn to recognize the alchemy and resist its seductions, or continue to live under the rule of gods. You pretend not to believe in gods of power, violence, and shadow, who demand blood in exchange for meaning. The controversial verdict. Why both tribes are wrong about what this murder means. When a political assassination occurs, the most urgent demand from the collective is, tell us what this means. The human psyche cannot bear the idea that death may be senseless. It hungers for interpretation, yet herein lies the peril. Interpretation, rushed and weaponized, becomes the very fuel that ensures further violence. Already, in the wake of Charlie Kirk's killing, both political tribes have begun to declare their verdicts. For one camp, the murder is proof of a war on conservatism, an assault on freedom of speech, and the climax of years of demonization. For the opposing camp, the death is interpreted through suspicion, irony, or as inevitable fallout from the incendiary rhetoric Kirk himself embodied. Both camps are wrong, not in the sense that their perceptions are wholly false, but in the deeper sense that each remains trapped in projection, unable to grasp the actual message of the unconscious event. The right is wrong because it interprets the act as an external plot against innocence. To imagine Kirk as a martyred saint is to ignore the complex role he played in inflaming the very passions that now consume the Republic. Martyrdom erases contradiction, it sanctifies without reflection. If conservatives cling to this narrative, they will elevate Kirk into an archetype of the slain hero while denying their own complicity in cultivating a political culture that thrives on apocalyptic imagery and battle metaphors. The danger is that martyrdom will become a rallying cry for vengeance, and vengeance will perpetuate the cycle. The left is wrong because it interprets the act as karmic inevitability, the logic of live by the sword, die by the sword. This narrative may carry a grain of truth, but it is a deadly one. To embrace, to reduce a killing to destiny, is to abandon empathy, to participate in the dehumanization that underlies all political murder. Worse, it blinds progressives to their own rhetoric, their own projections of hatred and superiority, their own addiction to polarization. By framing Kirk's death as an expected outcome, They deny the uncomfortable reality that their side too contributes to the climate in which assassination becomes thinkable. The real meaning is darker and more humbling. The murder is a mirror. It reveals that the United States has entered a stage where collective shadow dynamics have overpowered civic adulthood. The assassination is not the triumph of one ideology over another. It is the victory of the shadow over both. It is not proof of conservative victimhood or progressive vindication. It is proof of collective possession. If America continues down this path, more figures will fall. The names will differ, the affiliations will alternate, but the underlying pattern will persist. Each side will read each death as confirmation of its myth, and each time the gods of shadow will feast what then would actually break the spiral. The answer is controversial because it demands what neither tribe wishes to give: renunciation of innocence. Both camps must admit their complicity. Both must own that their rhetoric, their fantasies, their projections have prepared the soil for violence. This does not mean equal blame for every incident. It means equal recognition of the unconscious law that what is disowned will return and what is projected will demand blood. This renunciation would take the form of practices alien to your current culture. Deliberate slowing of interpretation, refusing to weaponize a killing within hours, allowing the wound to remain a wound before it is turned into a flag. Media reform, recognizing that platforms are not neutral and demanding architectures that interrupt rather than accelerate. Projection and outrage, civic rituals of grief, public mourning that acknowledges the humanity of the slain without enshrining them as symbols of absolute good or evil. Education in shadow literacy, teaching citizens how projection operates, how archetypes guide the individuals, how to recognize when they are possessed by the collective unconscious. None of these reforms are likely, for they require a humility alien to politics as currently practiced. But unless such humility emerges, the spiral will continue. And now, the most controversial conclusion. The assassination of Charlie Kirk was not only a crime, it was a confession. It was the nation confessing in blood that it cannot integrate its contradictions. It was the shadow's testimony forced into the open by violence. If you ignore the confession and return to your myths, you condemn yourselves to repetition. The gods of shadow are patient. They will wait for the next vessel. They will demand the next sacrifice. But the psyche is not only shadow. Within the same depths lies another archetype. The self, the wholeness that reconciles opposites, that holds tension without collapse, that transforms conflict into meaning rather than blood. If America can turn from projection to integration, from mythic vengeance to symbolic maturity, the murder might yet become not the beginning of civil collapse, but the painful threshold of awakening. That choice is before you, to see Charlie Kirk's death not as a tribal victory or loss, but as a revelation of your collective possession, to resist the temptation to sanctify or vilify, and instead to ask, what in me, what in us has conspired to make this possible? The answer will not comfort you, but it might save you. Both tribes are wrong, because both cling to innocence. The true verdict is that the assassination is not about one man, nor even one ideology, It is about the failure of a nation to confront its own shadow. Until that shadow is faced, the collective will remain possessed, and the cycle of sacrifice will continue